For decades, Pastor Donnie McClurkin stood before the world with a voice that sounded like survival itself. When he sang, people did not just hear music, they heard testimony. They heard a man who had walked through pain, trauma, rejection, and spiritual warfare, yet somehow found the strength to turn every scar into a sermon. His songs became more than gospel records. They became lifelines. In churches across America, in small living rooms where families were breaking quietly, in hospital rooms where people were praying for one more morning, and in lonely nights when faith felt like the only thing left, Donnie McClurkin's voice was there. He was not simply a singer, he was a symbol, a preacher, a survivor, a man many believed had been chosen to carry broken people back toward hope. But now, the same name that once brought comfort is standing in the middle of one of the darkest storms of his public life. And for many who loved him, followed him, defended him, and trusted him, the question is no longer just what happened. The question is how a man who built his life on healing could now become the center of such painful allegations. The headline sounds final. It sounds like a door closing, but the truth is more complicated and far more painful. Donnie McClurkin has not been publicly confirmed as criminally sentenced in connection with this matter. What he is facing is a civil lawsuit filed in New York by a former assistant, Giuseppe Corletto, who alleges years of sexual abuse. McClurkin, through his attorney, has strongly denied the accusations, calling them false and stating that he did not sexually abuse, assault, or coerce the plaintiff. That distinction matters. In the world of viral headlines, one word can destroy a reputation before a courtroom ever reaches a conclusion. But even when allegations remain legally unresolved, the emotional damage of the accusation itself can shake an entire community. For a pastor, especially one whose ministry is built on moral authority, public trust is not a small thing. It is the ground beneath everything. And once that ground begins to crack, every sermon, every song, every interview, every old statement, and every public memory gets pulled back into the light. That is why this story cuts so deeply. Donnie McClurkin's career was never just about performance. His power came from vulnerability. He spoke openly about childhood trauma. He spoke about wounds that many people would have hidden forever. He built a public identity around redemption, around being delivered from pain, around the belief that God could take the most damaged parts of a person's life and turn them into purpose. Songs like Stand and We Fall Down were not just church anthems. They became emotional rescue missions. They told people that failure was not final, that shame did not have to be permanent, that even after falling, a person could rise again. For years, this message made him one of the most recognizable voices in modern gospel music. He won awards, filled churches, preached to crowds, and became a spiritual figure for people who saw in him proof that suffering could be transformed. But public admiration has a dangerous side. The higher someone is placed, the more devastating the fall appears when accusations emerge. And in McClurkin's case, the allegations are especially explosive because they strike directly at the intersection of faith, sexuality, power, mentorship, and spiritual authority. According to reports about the lawsuit, Corletto says he first encountered McClurkin while seeking spiritual guidance, particularly around questions of sexuality and faith. That detail alone changes the emotional weight of the story. This is not merely an accusation between two public figures or business associates. It is framed as a story about trust, about a younger man looking to a religious leader for help, about the danger that can exist when spiritual influence becomes deeply personal. And when a lawsuit makes claims involving that kind of imbalance, the public reaction becomes more than curiosity. It becomes grief, anger, disbelief, and for some, a painful re-examination of what they thought they knew. Still, it is important to say clearly, allegations are not verdicts. A lawsuit is not the same thing as a conviction. McClurkin's legal team has denied the claims, and the matter must be judged through proper legal process, not through gossip, edited clips, or emotional comment sections. But the court of public opinion moves faster than any court of law. By the time lawyers file statements, the internet has already built its own trial. Supporters say he is being targeted, misunderstood, or falsely accused after decades of ministry. Critics say the allegations deserve serious attention and should not be dismissed because of his fame or religious status. Others are simply heartbroken, unsure what to believe, caught between the songs that carried them through their darkest days and the disturbing claims now attached to the man who sang them. And that is where the real tragedy of this moment begins. It is not only about Donnie McClurkin as a celebrity. It is about what happens when a spiritual icon becomes a human being under scrutiny. For years, gospel culture often treated gifted voices as proof of divine approval. If someone could sing with enough power to make people weep, if someone could preach with enough fire to fill an altar, if someone could speak the language of pain and deliverance, many assumed that their private life must somehow match their public anointing. But history has shown again and again that talent does not erase complexity. Ministry does not eliminate human weakness. Public holiness does not automatically guarantee private integrity. And when accusations surface against someone beloved, the community is forced into an uncomfortable place, separating the message from the messenger, the music from the man, the testimony from the truth still waiting to be established. For Donnie McClurkin, this moment may become one of the defining chapters of his legacy, not because the lawsuit has reached a final answer, but because the accusation itself has already changed the way many people see him. Some will continue to stand by him until every legal question is resolved. Some will never listen to his music the same way again. Some will demand accountability. Others will call for caution, prayer, and restraint. But no one can deny that something has shifted. The applause is quieter now. The questions are louder. The image of the victorious gospel legend has been replaced, at least for the moment, by the image of a man standing under a cloud he cannot simply sing away. And maybe that is why this story feels so heavy. Because Donnie McClurkin's entire career was built on the idea that people can survive the worst chapters of their lives. But now, he is facing a chapter that may test everything he ever preached about endurance, truth, repentance, justice, and grace. The world is watching. The church is whispering. The fans are divided. And somewhere between allegation and denial, between faith and doubt, between the stage lights and the courtroom filings, one painful question remains. When the voice that once helped millions stand is now the voice at the center of a storm, who gets to decide what his final legacy will be? Before the headlines, before the lawsuit, before the public began searching his name with suspicion instead of admiration, Donnie McClurkin was known as a man whose life seemed almost impossible to separate from pain. His story had always carried a heavy emotional gravity. He was not one of those gospel stars whose rise looked clean, polished, and effortless. He came into the public imagination as someone who had been wounded early and deeply, someone who did not hide that his childhood had been marked by trauma, confusion, and spiritual struggle. In many ways, that vulnerability became the foundation of his ministry. People believed him because he sounded like someone who had actually survived something. When he sang about standing, falling, healing, and being restored, it did not feel like performance. It felt like memory. It felt like a man reaching backward into the darkest rooms of his own life and pulling out a song for everyone else who was still trapped there. That is why his audience did not simply admire him. Many felt emotionally attached to him. Gospel music is not consumed the same way pop music is consumed. For many listeners, a gospel artist becomes part of their spiritual life. Their songs are played during funerals, baptisms, private breakdowns, hospital visits, Sunday services, and moments when people are trying to survive quietly without anyone knowing how close they are to giving up. Donnie McClurkin's music lived in those places. His voice entered spaces where people were grieving, repenting, hoping, and trying to believe that God had not abandoned them. So when accusations emerge around a figure like him, the reaction is not only about celebrity scandal. It touches people's memories. It makes them question the soundtrack of their healing. It forces them to ask whether the comfort they received can remain pure if the person who delivered it is now surrounded by troubling claims. Long before this legal storm, McClurkin had already lived a public life filled with tension. He was celebrated by some as a testimony of deliverance, while criticized by others for his public statements about sexuality and faith. He often spoke from the perspective of his own experiences, but those statements also placed him in the middle of larger cultural debates inside and outside the church. To his supporters, he represented transformation, discipline, and the power of spiritual conviction. To his critics, he became a symbol of how religious communities can sometimes turn personal pain into doctrine, especially around sexuality. That complicated history now makes the current allegations feel even more charged, because when a public figure has spent years speaking about moral struggle, healing, and spiritual authority, any accusation involving trust and sexual misconduct immediately reopens every old debate with sharper force. The lawsuit filed by Giuseppe Corletto is serious not because it has already been proven in court, but because of what it alleges about power. The most painful accusations in religious settings often involve more than the physical act described. They involve access, influence, dependency, and the belief that the person in authority was supposed to protect, guide, and spiritually care for someone. When the accused is a pastor, the issue becomes even more explosive because ministry carries an implied sacred responsibility. A pastor is not simply a public speaker. A pastor is trusted with confessions, wounds, family secrets, shame, and fear. People go to pastors when they are weak, not when they are strong. They go when they need direction. They go when they are searching for forgiveness, identity, or meaning. That makes any allegation of exploitation inside that relationship deeply destabilizing, even before a court determines what is legally true. For McClurkin's defenders, the timing and nature of the claims raise questions. They argue that a person should not be destroyed by an accusation alone, especially in an era when viral outrage can move faster than evidence. They point to his decades of ministry, his public transparency about suffering, his service to the church, and his denial through legal counsel. They say that fairness demands patience. They insist that due process matters, and they are right that due process matters. No serious conversation about justice can ignore that principle. A lawsuit must be tested, evidence must be reviewed, claims must face legal scrutiny. A person's life should not be permanently defined by allegations before the facts are examined in the proper forum. But for those who believe survivors are too often ignored, especially when the accused person is powerful, the instinct to defend a beloved leader can feel like another form of silence. They argue that churches and celebrity ministries have historically protected reputations before people. They ask why fame should make someone less accountable rather than more accountable. They question whether admiration can blind communities to warning signs. And they fear that religious language, words like grace, forgiveness, restoration, and attack, can sometimes be used to avoid hard questions. That is the tension at the center of this story. One side fears an innocent man could be publicly destroyed, while the other fears a possible victim could be dismissed, because the accused man is too beloved to question. This is why the Donnie McClurkin controversy cannot be reduced to a simple scandal headline. It is a mirror held up to gospel culture, celebrity ministry, and the fragile relationship between faith and accountability. It asks whether churches can love their leaders without worshiping them. It asks whether a person's anointing should protect them from scrutiny, or whether spiritual authority should actually invite a higher level of examination. It asks whether fans can hold compassion and caution at the same time. And most of all, it asks whether truth can survive in a world where everyone wants an answer before the process has even begun. For now, Donnie McClurkin remains in that painful middle space, neither legally condemned in this matter nor untouched by the shadow of what has been alleged. His songs are still known, his voice is still powerful, his history still matters, but the meaning of his public image has changed. The man who once stood on stages telling people to rise after falling is now standing in a storm where every word, every silence, and every legal development will be watched closely. And as the gospel world waits, one thing becomes painfully clear. This is no longer only about what Donnie McClurkin sang. It is about what the people who believed him are now willing to confront. What makes Donnie McClurkin's situation so emotionally complicated is that his entire public life has been built on the language of rescue. He did not become famous by presenting himself as untouchable. He became famous by telling people he had been broken. His testimony was never polished into something easy or comfortable. It carried the rawness of someone who had lived through private pain and then stood under bright lights to say, somehow, that God had kept him alive. That is why millions connected with him. They did not just hear a famous gospel singer. They heard a man who seemed to understand shame from the inside. They heard someone who could speak to the person sitting in the last pew, the person who felt too damaged to be loved, the person who believed their past had already decided their future. McClurkin's gift was not only musical range. His gift was emotional credibility. He made suffering sound survivable. But emotional credibility can become fragile when serious allegations appear. The same vulnerability that once made a public figure feel trustworthy can later make people revisit every part of the story with new suspicion. Listeners begin to ask uncomfortable questions. Was the testimony complete? Was the public image too carefully shaped? Did the pain he preached from become a shield that made people less willing to question him? These questions are not verdicts, and they should not be treated as proof of guilt. But they reveal how deeply public trust can be shaken. A celebrity can lose fans and still continue as an entertainer. A pastor can lose trust and lose the foundation of his calling. For a spiritual leader, credibility is not decorative. It is everything. Inside the gospel community, this kind of controversy creates a unique kind of silence. People do not always know how to respond when someone they admire is accused of something deeply disturbing. Some rush to defend him because they feel loyalty, gratitude, or disbelief. Others stay quiet because they fear being attacked by either side. Some pastors may avoid mentioning the issue because they do not want to divide their congregations. Some fans continue listening to the music privately, but stop sharing it publicly. That quiet hesitation is often the first sign that a legacy is changing. It does not happen all at once. It happens in small decisions. A song not played during service, a sermon clip not reposted, a name spoken more carefully than before. The public may still know him as a gospel legend, but the atmosphere around the name is no longer the same. What must also be understood is that gospel music carries a deeper moral expectation than most entertainment industries. In secular music, the artist can be messy, controversial, rebellious, even self-destructive, and still be accepted as part of the image. But gospel music is tied to testimony, worship, and spiritual authority. The audience is not simply asking, "Can this person sing?" They are also asking, "Can I trust the spirit behind the song?" That may not always be fair, because gospel artists are human beings with failures and contradictions like everyone else. But it is the reality of the space. When someone sings about holiness, deliverance, and restoration, the audience naturally connects the message to the messenger. And when the messenger is accused of violating trust, the music itself becomes emotionally complicated. This is the burden Donnie McClurkin now carries. Even if he continues to deny the allegations, even if the legal process unfolds slowly, the public damage has already begun. The court may eventually answer legal questions, but it cannot fully control the emotional questions. Can people still worship to his songs without thinking about the lawsuit? Can churches still invite him without controversy following him into the room? Can younger listeners separate his artistic contribution from the allegations attached to his name? Can longtime supporters defend him without appearing to dismiss the seriousness of the claims? These questions do not have simple answers. They live in the uneasy space between law, faith, memory, and personal conviction. There is also a generational divide in how people process stories like this. Older gospel audiences may be more inclined to wait, pray, and avoid public judgment. They may remember McClurkin's decades of service, his influence on gospel music, and the moments when his ministry genuinely helped people. Younger audiences, however, often approach accusations against powerful figures with more skepticism toward institutions. They have seen too many cases where churches, studios, schools, and public organizations protected influential men while vulnerable people were ignored. For them, The question is not only whether Donnie McClurkin is legally responsible, it is whether religious culture is capable of examining its heroes honestly. That generational split matters because it affects the future of his legacy. A legacy is not only what a person did, it is what future generations decide to remember. Donnie McClurkin's contribution to gospel music is already written into history, but the meaning of that contribution is still being negotiated. To some, he will remain a wounded healer whose songs carried them through grief. To others, his name may now represent the danger of placing spiritual leaders beyond scrutiny. To many, he will become something more complicated, a man whose voice changed lives, whose testimony moved millions, and whose public story now carries a shadow that cannot be ignored. And perhaps that is the most painful part of all. Donnie McClurkin spent years teaching that falling was not the end. But this moment is different from the kind of fall described in a worship song. This is not just a personal failure confessed at an altar. This is a legal and moral storm involving another person's allegations, a public denial, and a community forced to wrestle with truth before comfort. The gospel world often knows how to celebrate redemption, but it struggles with investigation. It knows how to sing about grace, but it does not always know how to sit with unresolved facts. It wants restoration, but restoration without truth becomes performance. It wants healing, but healing without accountability becomes denial. So now, as Donnie McClurkin's name continues to circulate through headlines, churches, and online debates, the story is no longer moving like a song with a clear chorus. It is moving like a slow, painful reckoning. Every side is waiting for something, a court update, a statement, a clarification, a defense, a revelation, a reason to believe, or a reason to let go. But until that answer comes, the image remains suspended in tension. The pastor with the powerful voice, the singer of survival, the man who told the broken to stand, now standing himself beneath the weight of questions that may define the rest of his life. There is a reason stories like Donnie McClurkin's feel different from ordinary celebrity controversy. When a movie star is accused, the public may argue about art, fame, reputation, and justice. When a politician is accused, people immediately see the issue through power and ideology. But when a pastor and gospel icon is accused, the wound reaches into a much more intimate place. It touches prayer. It touches testimony. It touches the moment someone stood in church with tears in their eyes, listening to a song that made them believe they could live another day. That is why the reaction around McClurkin is not simply public curiosity. It is spiritual disorientation. Many people are not just asking whether they can still admire him. They are asking whether the comfort they once received through his ministry has been contaminated by what they are now hearing. And that question is devastating because music, unlike a headline, attaches itself to memory. It becomes part of people's grief, healing, and survival. For years, Donnie McClurkin represented the idea that pain could be converted into purpose. His life story was often told as evidence that brokenness did not have to become a prison. He spoke with the authority of someone who understood trauma, and his audience responded because they recognized something real in him. In gospel culture, that kind of testimony is powerful. It gives a person moral weight. It allows them to stand before people not merely as an entertainer but as a witness. Yet that same moral weight becomes dangerous when the person becomes too protected by admiration. The church has often struggled with this contradiction. It teaches that all people are flawed, yet it sometimes treats gifted leaders as if their gift places them above ordinary accountability. It preaches humility, yet builds platforms so large that questioning the person on the platform can feel like questioning God himself. And that is where harm can begin, not necessarily from one accusation alone, but from a culture that becomes afraid to examine its own heroes. This controversy also exposes the uneasy relationship between forgiveness and accountability. In many faith communities, the language of forgiveness appears quickly when a beloved leader is under scrutiny. People say everyone deserves grace. They say no one is perfect. They say God can restore anyone. And all of that is true within the spiritual framework many believers hold. But forgiveness is not the same thing as erasure. Grace is not the same thing as silence. Restoration is not the same thing as returning someone to influence before the truth has been confronted. When allegations involve possible abuse of power, the first responsibility should not be to protect the comfort of the audience or the image of the institution. The first responsibility should be to seek truth carefully, protect the vulnerable, and refuse to let religious language become a curtain behind which difficult questions disappear. At the same time, the danger of public judgment cannot be ignored. The internet has created a world where accusation and conclusion often arrive in the same breath. A headline becomes a sentence, a lawsuit becomes a conviction. A denial becomes either proof of innocence or proof of manipulation, depending on what people already want to believe. In that environment, nuance is almost impossible. But nuance is exactly what this story requires. Donnie McClurkin has denied the allegations through his legal team. The claims have not been resolved by a final legal judgment. Those facts matter. They must be stated clearly. A serious society cannot claim to care about justice while abandoning due process whenever a story becomes emotionally explosive. But due process should not be used as a weapon to shame accusers into silence either. The harder truth is that both things can be true at the same time. The allegations deserve serious attention, and the accused person deserves a fair process. That balance is difficult because people do not come to stories like this as neutral observers. They come with histories. Some listeners grew up with Donnie McClurkin's music playing during the hardest seasons of their lives. Some people may have found strength in his testimony when they were battling shame or depression. Others may have had painful experiences in churches where powerful leaders were defended while vulnerable people were dismissed. For those people, this story may trigger a much larger pain than the headline itself. It may remind them of rooms where they were not believed, leaders who were protected, or communities that chose reputation over truth. That is why public conversations around religious misconduct allegations often become so emotional. They are rarely only about the famous person involved. They become containers for everyone's unresolved wounds with faith, power, family, authority, and silence. For McClurkin, this means the story is no longer fully in his control. Once a public figure becomes the subject of allegations this serious, the narrative escapes the stage. It moves into comment sections, church meetings, private conversations, legal filings, and the memories of people who feel either betrayed or defensive. His past interviews are re-watched. His old sermons are reinterpreted. His songs are heard differently. Even his silence becomes a message, whether he intends it or not. That is one of the brutal realities of public life. When trust is shaken, everything becomes evidence in the eyes of the public. A carefully worded statement may seem too cold. An emotional statement may seem manipulative. Refusing to speak may seem evasive. Speaking too much may seem desperate. In a storm like this, every path carries risk, and yet, beneath all the noise, there is still a human tragedy unfolding. There is a man whose name has been tied to gospel greatness for decades, now facing allegations that could permanently alter how that greatness is remembered. There is an accuser whose claims, if true, describe deep betrayal and harm. There is a faith community struggling to decide whether loyalty means defense, silence, prayer, skepticism, or accountability. There are fans who feel torn between gratitude for the music and discomfort with the allegations. There are critics who see this as another example of why religious celebrity must be questioned more aggressively. And there are people watching from a distance, wondering how many more times public holiness will be tested by private accusations before communities learn to build systems stronger than personality. This is why the Donnie McClurkin story cannot be wrapped up with a simple goodbye or a dramatic final sentence. It is not yet final in the legal sense, and it may never feel final in the emotional sense. Whatever happens next, the old image has already been fractured. The voice that once filled sanctuaries with certainty is now surrounded by uncertainty. The man who became famous for singing people through their falls is now facing a fall that cannot be turned into a chorus overnight. And as the world waits for truth to emerge through the proper process, the deeper question remains. Can a community built on faith be brave enough to seek truth without cruelty, offer grace without blindness, and protect the vulnerable without destroying the principle of fairness? The longer a controversy like this stretches across the public imagination, the more it becomes less about one headline and more about the architecture of belief around the person involved. Donnie McClurkin was never just a name on an album cover. For many people, he became part of the emotional furniture of their faith. His songs sat beside family memories, Sunday mornings, altar calls, funerals, recoveries, and moments when people were trying to believe that their lives still had meaning. That kind of bond is not easily broken, even when disturbing allegations appear. People do not detach from a voice like his overnight, because that voice is tied to seasons of their own survival. So when the lawsuit entered the public conversation, it did not simply challenge his reputation. It challenged the emotional investment of everyone who had used his music as a bridge back to hope. This is why the response has been so layered. Some people immediately searched for evidence to defend him, because defending him also meant defending a part of their own story. To admit that a figure who helped them might also be accused of serious harm is almost too painful to hold. Others reacted with anger because they have seen the same pattern too many times. A famous spiritual leader receives immediate protection, while the person making the allegation is questioned, dissected, and doubted before the process even begins. Between those two reactions is a third group, perhaps the largest and quietest, made up of people who simply do not know what to feel. They are not ready to condemn him. They are not willing to dismiss the suit. They still remember the songs, but they now hear them with a heaviness that was not there before. That silence is not indifference. It is emotional shock. For a gospel artist, that shock can be more damaging than public outrage. Outrage burns loudly, but shock lingers. It changes the atmosphere. It makes churches hesitate before booking appearances. It makes radio programmers and event organizers calculate risk. It makes pastors wonder whether mentioning his music will comfort the congregation or divide the room. It makes fans pause before sharing a clip online, because they know the comment section may turn into a battlefield. This is how public legacies begin to shift, not through one grand announcement, but through hundreds of small acts of hesitation. The name is still known, the voice is still respected, the songs are still powerful, but the certainty around them has been interrupted. And once certainty is interrupted, it rarely returns in the same form. At the center of this interruption is the unresolved nature of the case. Because there is no final legal conclusion publicly settling the allegations, everyone is trapped in a difficult moral waiting room. The people demanding accountability do not want patience to become an excuse for avoidance. The people demanding fairness do not want concern for the accuser to become automatic judgment against the accused. Both concerns matter. The problem is that public culture often has no discipline for waiting. It wants instant clarity. It wants heroes or villains. It wants confession, collapse, vindication, or punishment. But real legal and moral processes are slower than public appetite. They require documentation, testimony, response, review, and time. In the meantime, reputations bleed. Donnie McClurkin's situation also raises a painful question about what people expect from leaders who have built their ministries around trauma. When someone tells a story of survival over and over, that story can inspire millions. But it can also become a public identity so powerful that people stop seeing the person clearly. The survivor becomes a symbol. The symbol becomes protected. The protection becomes a culture of emotional loyalty. And emotional loyalty, when unchecked, can make communities resistant to difficult information. That does not mean McClurkin is guilty. It means the social structure around famous spiritual figures can make truth harder to pursue. When a person is loved for helping people heal, accusations against that person feel like an attack not only on the individual, but on the healing people experienced through them. That is why many believers are now being forced to separate two things they may have never separated before: the impact of the music and the accountability of the man. A song can still have helped someone in a real moment. A testimony can still have spoken to a real wound. A sermon can still have contained truth, but none of those things can be used to automatically answer questions about conduct. Good influence in one area does not erase the need for scrutiny in another. This separation is painful, but it is necessary for mature faith. Without it, communities become vulnerable to spiritual celebrity culture, where gifted people are treated as if their gifts are evidence in their defense. Talent may inspire trust, but it should never replace truth. The future of McClurkin's public life may depend not only on the legal process, but on how the community around him chooses to respond. If his supporters reduce everything to persecution, they may alienate people who believe the allegations deserve sober attention. If his critics reduce everything to guilt before adjudication, they risk abandoning the fairness they may rightly demand in other cases. The more responsible path is harder. Acknowledge the seriousness of the lawsuit, acknowledge the denial, allow the process to unfold, refuse cruelty, refuse blind defense, and keep the focus on truth rather than tribal victory. But responsible paths rarely go viral. Viral culture rewards certainty, not discipline. It rewards the loudest conclusion, not the most careful one. And so Donnie McClurkin remains caught between the life he built and the questions now surrounding it. His past still speaks loudly. His songs still carry history. His sermons still live in the memories of people who once needed his voice to survive. But this new chapter has placed a shadow across everything. It has forced the gospel world to confront the cost of turning ministers into icons, the danger of confusing anointing with immunity, and the difficulty of holding compassion and accountability in the same hand. Whether this becomes a temporary storm, a permanent stain, or a turning point in how faith communities handle allegations against powerful figures will depend on what comes next. But one thing is already clear. The old version of the story, the simple story of a wounded man who rose to help others rise, is no longer enough. Now the story is heavier, more complicated, and far more uncomfortable. And maybe that discomfort is exactly where the truth will have to begin. By this point in Donnie McClurkin's story, the most haunting thing is not only the allegation itself, but the silence that grows around it. Silence in a church world is never simple. Sometimes silence means prayer. Sometimes it means fear. Sometimes it means loyalty. Sometimes it means people are waiting for facts before they speak. But sometimes, silence becomes a shelter for uncomfortable truths no one wants to name. And that is why this moment feels so heavy. Because when a beloved spiritual figure is accused of serious wrongdoing, every person connected to the story must decide what their silence means. Are they being careful, or are they avoiding? Are they protecting fairness, or are they protecting power? Are they refusing gossip, or are they refusing accountability? Those questions do not have easy answers, but they are the questions that define how a community responds when its heroes are tested. For Donnie McClurkin, the weight of public expectation is almost impossible to escape. He built his ministry on words like healing, deliverance, restoration, and truth. These were not casual themes in his career. They were the center of his public identity. He became a voice for people who believed their pain could still have purpose. But now, the very words that made him powerful also make this controversy more difficult. If a man preaches healing, people expect him to understand harm. If a man preaches truth, people expect transparency. If a man preaches restoration, people expect accountability before redemption. This is where many religious scandals become so painful. The language that once inspired trust becomes the language by which the public measures the accused leader, and yet the story remains legally unresolved. That fact must stay in view. McClurkin has denied the accusations through his legal representation. The lawsuit is not the same as a conviction. The claims must be examined through evidence, legal procedure, and due process. But unresolved does not mean insignificant. The absence of a final judgment does not erase the seriousness of the allegations. It only means the public must resist the temptation to turn uncertainty into certainty too quickly. This is one of the hardest disciplines in any scandal involving faith and fame. To care deeply without pretending to know everything. To take allegations seriously without declaring a verdict before the process is complete. and to defend fairness without dismissing pain. What makes this especially difficult is the symbolic power of Donnie McClurkin's name. He is not a minor figure whose influence can be quietly contained. His music traveled across generations. His testimony became part of gospel history. His voice shaped worship services, choir rehearsals, televised revivals, and private moments of grief. For many people, his songs are not entertainment. They are spiritual memory. That is why any question about his legacy becomes so emotionally charged. People are not just debating a celebrity. They are debating whether a piece of their faith experience can remain intact. They are asking whether the song that helped them survive can still mean what it meant before. And the painful answer may be that the song can still have mattered, while the man behind it must still face scrutiny. That separation is the beginning of maturity. Immature celebrity culture says the gift proves the person. Mature faith says the gift must never cancel accountability. Immature loyalty says criticism is betrayal. Mature love says truth matters more than image. Immature outrage says accusation is the same as guilt. Mature justice says claims must be heard, tested, and handled with seriousness. The gospel world, like every community built around public figures, is now being asked to grow up in real time. It must decide whether it will build its future around personalities or principles. Because if everything depends on the reputation of one gifted person, then the entire community becomes fragile. But if the community is built on truth, process, care, and accountability, then even painful stories can become moments of correction rather than collapse. There is also a deeper tragedy in how public life turns human beings into symbols before the full truth is known. To his supporters, Donnie McClurkin may now symbolize a righteous man under attack. To his critics, he may symbolize the failure of religious celebrity culture. To some survivors of abuse, the story may symbolize how difficult it is to come forward against powerful spiritual figures. To others who fear false accusations, it may symbolize how quickly a life's work can be damaged by claims not yet proven. Each group sees part of the story through the lens of its own experience. That is why the public conversation becomes so intense. People are not only arguing about McClurkin, they are arguing through him, using his case to express their deepest fears about justice, faith, power, and trust. But beyond all of that, there is still the question of legacy. Legacy is not just a list of achievements. It is the moral atmosphere that remains around a person's name. Donnie McClurkin's achievements are undeniable. A celebrated gospel career, songs that reached millions, a ministry that influenced countless believers, and a testimony that once made him feel uniquely connected to the wounded. But legacy is also vulnerable. It can be reshaped by one unresolved chapter, especially when that chapter touches the very themes a person spent his life preaching about. The old story was clear. A wounded man found God, rose from pain, and helped others stand. The new story is not clear at all. It is filled with allegations, denial, legal uncertainty, public division, and a church community struggling to understand what faithfulness looks like when the facts are still unfolding. That is why the phrase "goodbye forever" feels emotionally powerful, but legally and morally premature. It may express how some people feel, as if the old image of Donnie McClurkin has already disappeared. But the actual story is not finished. The court process is not a YouTube title. Truth does not move at the speed of drama. And if there is anything this moment demands, it is the discipline to resist easy endings. For now, Donnie McClurkin stands in a place few public figures survive unchanged, between the music that made him beloved and the allegations that now make his name painful to speak. Whether he is ultimately vindicated, diminished, or permanently redefined, this chapter has already forced a reckoning. The gospel world must decide what it values more: the comfort of familiar heroes, or the courage to pursue truth, even when the person under scrutiny once sang the songs that helped it believe. In the end, the most painful part of Donnie McClurkin's current chapter is that it refuses to give people the simple ending they want. Supporters want vindication. Critics want accountability. The public wants clarity. The internet wants a verdict. But real life, especially when faith, fame, trauma, and legal allegations collide, rarely moves with that kind of neat timing. It leaves people waiting in the uncomfortable middle, where every answer feels incomplete and every reaction carries risk. That is where McClurkin's name now lives. Not in the old certainty of applause, not in the finality of judgment, but in a suspended space where his past achievements and present allegations are being weighed against each other in public view. For a man who once stood before thousands, with a voice that made people believe broken things could still rise, this is perhaps the most difficult stage he has ever faced. A stage where singing is not enough, preaching is not enough, and reputation is no longer enough to quiet the questions. What this moment has revealed is that no legacy, no matter how powerful, is immune from scrutiny. Donnie McClurkin's music may still remain meaningful to millions. His songs may still echo in churches and private memories. His testimony may still represent survival for people who once felt trapped inside shame. But influence cannot become a wall against examination. The same public trust that lifted him also requires accountability when serious allegations are made. That does not mean assuming guilt. It does not mean erasing decades of work without a fair process. But it does mean refusing to treat spiritual fame as protection from hard questions. If the gospel world learns anything from this moment, it should be that gifted leaders must never become untouchable, because the moment a community makes a person untouchable, it also makes vulnerable people easier to ignore. At the same time, this story also warns against the cruelty of instant judgment. A lawsuit is not a conviction. An allegation is not a final sentence. A denial is not automatically proof of innocence either. The truth must be pursued with discipline. That discipline is difficult because people want certainty, especially when the person involved is emotionally important to them. But justice requires more than emotional reaction. It requires patience, evidence, process, and the courage to hear things that may disturb the image people have carried for years. It also requires compassion for everyone involved, including those who say they were harmed, and those who stand accused before the facts have been fully tested. Without that balance, public conversation becomes either blind loyalty or public execution, and neither one can produce truth. For many longtime listeners, the hardest work will be internal. They will have to decide what to do with songs that once healed them. They will have to decide whether the music can remain part of their lives, while the man behind it faces serious questions. Some will turn away completely. Some will separate the message from the messenger. Some will wait until the legal process develops further. Some will continue to pray for everyone involved. There is no easy emotional script for that. A person can be grateful for a song and still demand accountability. A person can refuse to rush to judgment and still take allegations seriously. A person can believe in grace and still understand that grace without truth is not healing. It is avoidance. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside this entire controversy. Faith communities often know how to celebrate victory, but they struggle with ambiguity. They know how to sing after deliverance, but they do not always know how to sit inside unresolved pain. They want testimonies with clean endings. I was lost, then I was found. I was broken, then I was restored. I fell, then I stood again. Donnie McClurkin's music thrived on that structure. But this chapter does not yet have that kind of ending. It is not a finished testimony. It is a reckoning in progress. It asks the church to remain morally awake before the conclusion arrives. It asks fans to resist both denial and cruelty. It asks leaders to stop hiding behind platforms and start building systems where truth can be examined without fear. Whatever happens next, the old image of Donnie McClurkin has already changed. That does not mean his entire life's work has disappeared. It means his story has become more complicated than the version many people wanted to believe. He is no longer only the voice of stand. He is now also the figure at the center of a painful public question about power, trust, ministry, and accountability. For some, that change will feel like betrayal. For others, it will feel like a necessary awakening. For everyone watching honestly, it should feel like a warning. Never confuse a powerful gift with a complete picture of a person. So if this is a goodbye, it may not be goodbye to Donnie McClurkin the man, because his legal and personal story is still unfolding. It may be goodbye to a simpler era, an era when audiences could place gospel icons on pedestals and believe the music alone told the whole truth. That era is fading. People are asking harder questions now. They are less willing to accept charisma as evidence, less willing to mistake public tears for private integrity, and less willing to let spiritual language silence uncomfortable realities. And maybe that is not the death of faith, but the maturing of it. Donnie McClurkin once taught millions that falling was not final. Now the world is watching to see what truth, justice, and grace will mean when the fall is not a lyric, but a living controversy. His future may still be written in courtrooms, statements, pulpits, and the private hearts of those who once believed in him without hesitation. But the larger question belongs to the community that made him a legend. When the song ends, when the spotlight dims, when the allegations remain and the applause becomes uncertain, will people still choose truth over comfort? That may be the real final sentence. Not a sentence handed down by rumor, not a sentence written by a viral headline, but the sentence history will write about whether faith communities learned to protect people more than platforms, and truth more than icons.